Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be reading Let's Not Meet Horror Stories. I hope you enjoy them. So, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. This was some years ago when I was living in a different city. I hadn't really been on my own all that long, and my housing situation fell apart at the last minute, so I had to scramble to figure it out. Meaning, you guessed it, random roommates. Now, the year before, I'd had a random roommate that was the most amazing person and ended up becoming a great friend. So I figured this would be the same. It was not. But that's not actually the focus of this story. Enter the roommates. Ben, who I did actually know a bit from the previous year and was becoming friends with. Tom and Mike. Now, this was the very first couple of days after the move-in, and we'd all hung out to get to know each other better. But Tom and Mike hadn't fully moved in yet. It was a big old house separated by a floor, and the top level locked at the stairs. This is important to note. Ben and I lived upstairs with Tom and Mike downstairs. I've always been paranoid, and definitely have good reason. So when I'm home, all the doors are locked. When I leave, all the doors are locked. I sleep with my bedroom locked. I was home alone with Ben at work, and Tom and Mike sort of in and out moving stuff. I'll note here that both had a lot of expensive stuff, like in the 5-figure range. Well, I was watching something on my laptop in my room. Bedroom locked and both entrances to my part of the house locked. I started hearing a lot of noise coming from downstairs, sounding like doors and cupboards opening, furniture moving, etc. And I figured it was just Tom or Mike, until I hear footsteps coming upstairs. I was technically supposed to be somewhere at the time, which they knew, but it had been canceled last minute, so no one would have known that I was home. And they had no reason to come upstairs when they knew both of us were supposed to be gone. That was when I got panicky, hearing them come closer and closer to the top of the stairs. I've never sat so still. Then the knob began to jiggle. I could hear it clearly as my room was closest to the entryway. At this point, I'm on with 911, whispering that someone is in my house without giving away that I'm there to whoever it was. The house was super close to downtown, and cops arrived in mere minutes, but they were the longest of my life at that moment. The downstairs was completely ransacked, like something out of a movie. It was so surreal to see. They'd taken over $20,000 in electronics. Honestly, I don't remember the exact amount, just about that I think. Broken furniture and plates and stuff, even ripped through the mattresses. Turned out, Tom and Mike had left a door unlocked when moving. This would not be the last time before I fled this house. They were gone before the cops showed, so I'd spent the next several months afraid that they'd come back, though it would turn out to be the least of my future worries. So glad that I always locked the doors. Considering the way downstairs looked, I don't know what they would have done to me. To whoever was on the other side of that, thankfully locked door, let's not meet. So earlier this summer, I, a 16-year-old male, got my driving license for a 50cc moped, common and popular thing here in Europe. And I was so hyped to finally get to ride with my friends and explore places that I couldn't have explored before without my moped. And everything went great for the first couple of days, until one day, me and my friends were just out cruising and having fun, and it was a warm and sunny summer evening, so we decided to go ride on some smaller gravel roads on the countryside. So we did that, and we were riding there for maybe an hour, until everyone had to get home but me. It was probably like 1 to 2 a.m. at that point, but I still decided to stay there and just ride around and listen to some music in my headphones. So I started riding towards this one small village surrounded by fields, and there was a lot of farms there. So I rode a bit slower than usual so there wouldn't be any accidents with all the tractors and farm vehicles. But after I got through the village and closer to a bigger road, the sun was almost gone and it was getting seriously dark outside. It had been a nice ride, and I decided to start heading home on this almost empty highway, even though the speed limit was 100 kilometers per hour, and it's not allowed to ride a 50cc moped on the highways, but I did it anyway. Home was almost 30 kilometers away from where I was at that point, so I was just riding full speed in case to get home before my parents found out that I'd been outside until 3 a.m. But when I had been riding for like 15 minutes, I saw a car stopped on the side of the road with the lights on, and it got me a bit creeped out, to be honest. But I just pushed it out of my mind and kept going since I was almost halfway home. But after a few minutes, I noticed the car from earlier speeding up after me. And since I have a moped that goes only like 80 to 90 kilometers per hour, the car caught up to me pretty quickly. And then the car started to pass me. And when it got beside me, I looked in there and I saw a man covered in blood. And he was looking straight at me with the craziest eyes I've ever seen, if you get what I'm saying. And he was smiling at me. So I got very scared, and he rode along with me for probably a minute, but it felt like hours with him just staring at me and looking at the road every once in a while. Then the man raised his other hand and waved me goodbye, before putting his fingers on his lips and doing the shush thing. And after that, he sped off and got off the highway onto a ramp to a smaller road. And when he did that, I saw that the car didn't even have a license plate. That was a super creepy experience. And I don't know why the man was covered in blood, and why he had been parked on the side of an empty road at 3 a.m. But what I know for sure is that he was somebody that I never want to meet again. This is so bizarre. This isn't even a memory I forgot, just one that I basically turned into my own fun anecdote to make it less scary. 11 years later, it's really scary, and I know how lucky I was. For context, I was a fresh 21-year-old and had recently rediscovered a love of dance and started enjoying concerts and festivals. I had attended my first festival at 20 and had the most amazing time volunteering and meeting people. It was a last-minute and unexpected situation that first year, but after the amazing experience I had, I was hooked. It's prudent to add that I was extremely naive and obviously new to that kind of scene. So the next year, I had cut off the friends I'd gone to festivals with before, but still had friends of friends that went that I got along with really well and had good memories with. So even though I was going to my second year at the same festival, I was going solo and just camping with friends of friends, which I suppose was the beginning of the problem. I got going kind of late, so when I got to the festival, the lines were getting extremely long. I'd packed diligently, but the service wasn't great, and I was having a hard time contacting the semi-friends that I was camping with. By the time I found them and had to set up, it was dark. It was a newer but pretty large festival, and I have a really bad sense of direction. In future years, I'd learned to bring battery/solar lights and obnoxious decorations because of this night. It was also in a different location that year, so unfamiliar with where I'm camped, with my surroundings. Second part, I messed it up. My ex-roommate Tom and his girlfriend Gina were the ones I was closest to, and Tom was bringing some special acid for me, as kind of an apology for not sticking up for me in a roommate situation. It's for a different sub, so I haven't posted about it. We all went to the first show together, but all got really high so fast. I took too much and knew it pretty quickly, so I knew the night was going to go sideways. But by the time that I'd realized, Tom and Gina had wandered off, leaving me completely alone. I tried to find my way to my tent, thinking I'd lay down for a bit and be okay, but I couldn't remember how to get to it or where it was. It was dark and I was starting to panic, being that I was high and didn't know where anyone I knew was. Didn't know how to find my campsite or anything. I was in a crop top and jean shorts in high desert at nighttime, so it was starting to get cold. I wandered over to the disco area because it was the first thing I found. Had a legit disco ball and all. I'm wandering around and see this woman in the most unusual clothing. Think almost pioneer. So I went to talk to her. I genuinely to this day don't know if this person was real. That's how messed up I was. We end up wandering around. Again, not sure if this was a real person or a hallucination. Trying to find my campsite when we reached the RV and car camp area. This man, maybe in his early 30s with glow sticks, asks if we want any, and we say yeah. She goes first, and as soon as it's on her wrist, goes skipping away. I call out to her to wait, but she doesn't stop. The man looks at me and says, "Are you okay? Do you think you can find your friend?" I stupidly say, "Oh, I don't know her really. I can't find my campsite and she was helping, but oh well." He responds with, "You remind me a lot of my little sister. I wouldn't want her running around lost like this. Look, my buddy and I are going to go watch XYZ shows, and I wouldn't feel right leaving you. So you could stay in his RV for a few hours to sleep it off." Obviously, I was too high, too young, too naive to see where this would go, and I stupidly complied and followed him. It was fine at first. It was a toy hauler, I think that's what it's called. So the back end was like a U-Haul that stayed open. The first guy put on an album I'd previously loved as a teenager, but now can barely still listen to. Tucked me in and left. I didn't see his buddy at that point. Fast forward God knows how many hours. I've been tripping out to this music and actually been getting to the point of being okay when they get back. For the record, I didn't request this particular band. It was on a loop. First thing was, the guy that told me that I looked like his sister climbed on top of me while I was half conscious, kissing my neck and touching me. Then I felt the second one and his hands. I was still so high and out of it, but immediately told them to stop, that I wasn't in a place for that. They got angry, and the one who'd gotten me there was the most frightening. I saw his eyes change in that moment, and I knew that I was messed up if I couldn't get away. It didn't matter how high I was, I needed to get away from them. I don't even recall formulating a plan. I remember the main man saying, "We helped you, now you owe us," and slamming my knee into his groin. I may have forgotten that he was on top of me at that point. All I remember is running for my life into the very prickly bushes, not knowing where I was going, but desperately running away. The second man seemed a bit nervous about the whole thing and didn't do much except for touch me, while the other man held me down with the weight of his body. I met a couple of kind souls that calmed me down when I was completely freaking out, crying, covered in dirt and thorns, and they gave me a safer space. I didn't sleep well that night, as I could no longer trust the kind stranger, but I also couldn't find my camp. It was 10 yards away as I discovered the next day. To the two men who tricked me, trapped me, and would have done something inevitably bad to me, let's not meet again. Edit. I forgot to add this because it's a pretty intense memory for me, but I'm pretty sure that the only reason I got away was because they were on something. I hadn't even met guy number 2 before, so I don't know about him. But the one I did seemed crazed and very amped and high and out of it. And yes, I know the whole thing was stupid of me. I was not even a month into 21, with very little life experience. Several years ago, I had a very quick trip to Denver planned, 23 hours total, to visit a friend before they moved away. I was young, broke, and working a crappy entry-level job, so it was the best I could do with my one day off. I went straight from work to the airport and got into DIA around 11 p.m. I was bunking on the couch of an old college friend, and they lived 30 to 40 minutes from the airport. Fortunately, the light rail had recently been extended out to the airport, and my friend lived near the light rail line. I had taken the light rail often when living in Denver myself, but was not familiar with the newer additions. I barely made it to the train before it set off, grateful to not have to wait around for another half hour at that time of night. It was nearing midnight as the train pulled into a brightly lit Union Station. I looked around for my connection, but it was nowhere to be found, not realizing that the connecting line was not there. Fortunately, I was able to flag down security, and they pointed me in the right direction. A few blocks away, there was another brightly lit station, separated by roughly 200 yards. Unlike the stations, there were hardly any lights, just some light spilling in from either side, where the train platform stood. I was only traveling with a backpack, so I was able to move quickly, moving out of Union Station and towards the other platform, hoping I was going to make my next train. As I got further away from the station and my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noted a large figure standing in the middle of the sidewalk ahead of me. I quickly gauged my surroundings and realized there were no other paths unless I walked in the road. I decided to keep on the path and do my best to come across with a "I see you and I am not scared" attitude. As I drew closer, I could make out a tall, muscular man, probably in his 20s or 30s. As I got closer, I made eye contact to let him know that I recognized his presence, and he was already staring right at me, mumbling to himself. As I passed by him, I could hear what he was mumbling. He was not speaking to me, but instead he was speaking about me. And as I walked past him, he began to follow me. I began to walk fast, and he began to walk faster. All the while, he was saying things like, "Ooh, look at that body. She's so fine, I want to feel that body," along with other sexual and crude comments about me, all being muttered to himself. The second station was still another 100 yards or so away, and there was nowhere I could go in between. I pulled out my cell phone and rang my dad, desperate for him to answer. The call went to voicemail, but I pretended he had picked up. As soon as I began talking, the man spoke to me for the first time and said, "Ooh, girl, I didn't mean you no harm," and the footsteps faded back. I kept up the fake conversation for a moment longer before looking back, and he was nowhere to be found. Like I mentioned previously, I had looked around for places I could escape and could not find any. I am confident with his size, if he had done anything, I would not have stood a chance. I burst into the light of the station, barely made my train, and ultimately missed my stop because I was so shaken up and had to ride the train back around. I finally rested my head on a pillow at my friend's around 2 a.m., never to travel alone at night, and whoever the disappearing man in the street was, let's never meet again. I am a teenager who helps his dad out on the allotment. If you don't know, an allotment is like a mini farm. You can plant veggies, have animals like chickens or rabbits to care for, etc. This happened recently, and this still creeps me out. In the evening, my dad says we need to go to the allotment to feed our chickens, as he forgot to feed them earlier that day. It was around 8 p.m. when I agreed and went in the car and started driving. When we got to our allotment, which is like a 15-minute drive, it was already dark outside. Not a lot, but dark. I opened the gates to the allotment, let my dad drive in, and then closed them. As I was about to, though, I saw a black car outside. The car belonged to a guy that used to be chill with my dad, but they both kind of fell off from talking to each other. My dad said he was becoming more mentally ill as the guy had a divorce and got his kids taken by the mother. The guy lives on the allotment now, even sleeping there. Remember, there's other people too on this allotment area, around 20 other ones, but there was no one else except me, dad, and the guy. After my dad parked the car, we got out and started getting the food for the chickens out of the trunk. While my dad was doing that, I looked at his ex-friend's allotment only to see him staring at us. It was dark, so I can only see a shadow of him, but I knew he was staring at us. I had a gut feeling, but I decided to ignore it. We went to the allotment, fed the chickens, and were about to go home until my dad almost forgot about something. He went to the shed at the end of the allotment to fetch something, and I was going to enter, but had a feeling to wait out instead. As I told my dad how much longer till he finds what he needed, I turned back to face our gate being opened. I didn't see it at first, but saw the guy trying to enter our allotment quietly. He stared at me and slowly closed the gate before just disappearing. I didn't react or say anything. I just stood there. I thought of telling my dad but didn't want to scare him or something. In the end, this isn't a horror movie where I should scream like a girl. When my dad left the shed, now we could go. As we were leaving, we heard a sound like an axe hitting wood nonstop. We knew something was wrong. We quickly walked to our car, started it, and went to the gate. I left the car, creeped out of the guy being around in the allotment. I quickly opened the gate and let my dad drive through. As I was closing the gate, I saw something that terrified me on the spot. The guy was just standing there, 20 m away from me, looking at me. I couldn't see any details but just darkness on him. He was holding something in his hand, but then he just moved and went into some bushes. My dad got out of the car to lock the gate. He looked at the bushes through the closed gate and rushed to his car. When we left and started driving, I told my dad if he saw what I saw. He said he saw him hiding in the bushes, squatting, looking at us. Dad said he saw him holding something too, like an axe or knife. We left terrified, but we tried to laugh it off, knowing we were probably close to being attacked, or worse, dead. We came back to the allotment at the same time around 8 p.m., a few days after what happened. We saw the guy's car in the allotment, and we knew we needed to be quick with feeding the chickens. As we did so, everything was going fine until, as we were about to leave, my dad stopped me and we hid over a blue shed. My dad told me he's there, he's in the bushes. My heart dropped. I told my dad where he was, and he said 5-second walk and we were done. We quickly ran to the car, closed it, and drove off. For a second I saw him. He had an axe. He wanted to sneak up on us, harm us. He wanted to kill us. So, this is something I've kept completely to myself, except for a confused call to my best friend the morning after to try and figure out if what I thought happened actually happened. Truthfully, the event that incited this incident was my fault, and also so stupid, so I think I've been too embarrassed or mad at myself to share the story. I had only been living in New Orleans for about 2 weeks the night this occurred, and while I'd never been to New Orleans once in my life prior to moving there, a decision resulting from my desperation to get a job out of college, I am from a similarly large metro area in the American South. So, I'm familiar with the dynamic of a city like this. One minute you'll see kids playing catch in the streets, and young couples walking arm in arm down tropically adorned sidewalks. And the next dilapidated houses, still not made whole since Katrina and further degraded from Ida. Gang violence, young boys posted up on street corners, and unimaginable poverty tied to rampant drug abuse. In the end, it's just all about knowing where to go and which areas to avoid entirely. Anyway, I was driving home from running some obscure errand at night around 9:30 p.m. that caused me to drive through St. Claude. For y'all that don't know, this is certainly one of those neighborhoods that should be avoided if possible. As I came upon a stop sign right next to a small community center food bank place, I suddenly slammed on the brakes due to driver's instinct, before really even understanding why I did it. Standing there just feet away from my front bumper was a teeny tiny cat, its wide eyes staring back at me in terror. It became briefly blinded by my headlights. That stupid cat. This is where my stupidity comes into play. I didn't really know where I was and how dangerous of an area it was, and without even thinking for a single moment, I stepped outside of the car to assess the situation, maybe see if I could help the little guy. I didn't even remove my keys from the ignition, as I figured I'd only be there for a tiny bit. Didn't even grab my phone from the charger. I figured I'd either be able to beckon over the little cat and help it, or watch it dart away before slipping back into my car and continuing on home. What I didn't realize when I knelt down on the pavement was that my clumsy butt was too close to the barely open car door, and when I stood up, of course, I bumped it and it immediately swung shut. No big deal, I thought, convincing myself that that door would be unlocked, only to feel my whole heart sink like a stone into my stomach when the door didn't budge. I didn't panic immediately. After trying all 4 doors and cursing myself for a solid minute for being such an idiot, I spotted a man sitting on the steps of the community center eating, and he spotted me. Noticing my situation and to my dismay, he slowly stood and came to the back of my car with his bag of Raising Cane's chicken, plopped it down on the hood, and proceeded to enjoy his dinner on the back of my Subaru. I'd already been there for a good 10 minutes by this point, so honestly the company of another person was relieving. I didn't look as helpless to passerbys with him there. After I explained my situation, he explained he could try to jimmy-rig the door open, and desperate to get back in, I agreed. It was useless, unfortunately, and I could tell he was just fiddling around. I trotted over to a small church across the intersection, where I spotted a few people closing up for the night. Sanctuary, I thought. Nice churchgoers have to help a woman lost and alone, right? Wrong. The man locking up looked straight through me, back at the man now clearly trying to open a locked car, shook his head and shot me a glance that said, "Do you think I'm stupid?" and stepped right into his unlocked vehicle. It was at this point that I felt the tears welling up, but quickly told myself to suck it up and walked dejectedly back over to my car. By the grace of God, the random stranger let me use his phone to call a locksmith, tastefully called Papa Lock, who told me he'd be there anywhere between 45 minutes and 4 hours. Great. After about 25 minutes of chit-chatting, the man informed me that his shift was about to start, and just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. This is when the gravity of my situation really began to sink in, and I became acutely aware of my surroundings. Acutely aware of the men who had been circling the block on their bicycles during our conversation. I don't know about y'all, but I don't know many grown men who ride around leisurely on bikes after 10 p.m. just for the fun of it, especially not in the same big circles in the same neighborhood. I heard the distant squeak of the wheels, and before I could duck for cover, they lapped the block again, now aware that I was, in fact, utterly alone. They continued down the block, and I realized quickly that I needed to find somewhere to be by the time they returned. I swiftly walked towards the community center, where I'd planned on sitting on the stairs, but quickly realized it was entirely too illuminated, and I'd be making myself a beacon amid the darkness of the neighborhood. Plus, as I rounded the corner, I saw a tall man standing in total darkness along the side of the building, just staring straight forward facing the steps not 10 feet away from them. Getting desperate, I jogged over to the church, and hearing the wheels nearing again, I squatted down behind the big sign in front of the building. As I sat there in the dirt, I couldn't help it anymore and cried just a little bit. The combination of fear and frustration really put it over the edge. After a while, I didn't hear any more movement, and because my butt hurt from sitting on the ground and the bugs were starting to come out beneath me, I decided to move spots like some stupid game of hide and seek. I had spotted a fenced-off area that appeared to be a restaurant earlier, and after finding the door to be unlocked, I darted inside and latched it behind me, sighing with relief. At that point, I situated myself at a table where I could peer through the fence at my car to see if the locksmith pulled up and waited. After what felt like days but was probably more like 2 hours, the horrifying realization dawned on me that I had only made one singular call to the Papa Lock people, and gave a vague description of the intersection where I was at. What if they couldn't find me? What if they had already driven past long ago, and not seeing me there, were long gone by now? I didn't know if I should keep waiting or venture back out in hopes of catching them if they were circling the block looking for my car. After about 30 minutes, I decided I would just have to go out there. The men were gone, and although it was a bad neighborhood, it'd just get progressively worse come the early hours of the morning, and I didn't want to find out. It is so painfully obvious in retrospect. But of course, the moment I left the safety of my little restaurant hideaway, those dang wheels began to round the corner. I literally could not have looked more out of place and vulnerable. I felt so exposed, but there was no time to go back across the intersection to the fenced-off area, and to get to the church, I'd have to run through the bike path of the two men. As I sprinted toward my car, a black truck rolled by, and to my horror, stopped just moments after passing me, put it in reverse, and began to roll slowly back in my direction. I almost resigned myself to my seemingly inevitable capture, assault, and God knows what as I watched it roll toward me. I pretended to walk away, as if I were not utterly aimless, trying to give off the impression that I wasn't locked out of my still running car, without any and all resources. The men on the bikes were so close now. Then, as if in an episode of CSI, the Papa-Lock truck rounded the corner. I instantly began waving my arms to flag them down, and as the truck drove off, my savior parked his van. Apparently, he had been looping around the area for 20 minutes, trying to find me, and was about to give up to go help another stranded woman. If I had stayed behind the fence, he likely would have, and I would have been left without any means of communication to call anyone else for help. The moment I got inside my beloved Subaru, I began sobbing at the click of the locks behind me. God, it was pure relief to be secured within a locked space. Even as I'm writing this now, I feel dramatic, like I was freaking out over nothing. But, in my recollection, working through the details does help to validate my experience. So to those men on their dinky little bikes, let's never meet again. Hello everyone. Here I am, explaining what is happening to me, and I'll try to be as precise as possible. I've lived in the same neighborhood for many years. This is also the case for many people, which means that even if everyone does not speak to each other, we often know people, at least by sight. A year ago, I passed a guy on a street near my house whom I had never seen before, and I noticed him because he had a rather unusual physique. About 50 years old, tall, thin, emaciated face, dressed in a suit and tie. From the look of his face, he does not seem to be in good health. In short, nothing special so far. But what I have noticed for the past year is that there are times of varying length when he is everywhere I am. To give an example, last Wednesday I went to the pharmacy. He was behind me and he also went to the pharmacy. Thursday, I go to a neighboring town to do some shopping. I meet him in the street. Friday, I leave my house to go to the gym. He's in front of my house and walks part of the way with me before taking another street. This kind of thing can last several days, every day, then it stops, before I see him constantly for several days. He is constantly in a suit and tie, as if he was going to work, but I see him at any time, on weekdays, weekends, in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. I don't know where he lives exactly, but I know that he is not in my immediate vicinity. I never see him talking to anyone on the street. So yes, I know coincidence, most certainly. But I admit that in the end, I ask myself questions. It gives me a feeling of being followed, even if I may be exaggerating. Has this kind of thing or strange feeling towards someone ever happened to you? This story occurred a couple of years ago when I was working in my hometown. I got hired for a retail job in October of 2020, and it was my first ever job. I was one of those first-time workers who was heavily devoted to pleasing the boss for more hours. So as I had become better at my job, I would be assigned the sales section, which at the time was closest to our only entrance at the time, and faced all the people walking by the store. I had been assigned to this section for about 2 weeks. It was around Christmas time, so a few months into me being there, and I had already encountered one weird man who was either a dad or an uncle. Assumed because he asked me about buying children's clothes for Christmas, where I tried telling him that we didn't have what he was looking for. He followed up by asking me if I lived around the area, what else I did other than work, etc. I shot him down when I told him a blatant lie about me not having a phone number to give him, or any social media to give him either, because I'm not into that. I already felt on edge with this man, but what came a few days after had scared me. While I was working in the sales section, I noticed the men who wouldn't go with their wives into the store next door because of what the store sold, predominantly for women. I would notice a lot of men would wait for their wives outside the store, or maybe glance at me fixing clothes. However, there was this one guy who I didn't see have a wife or a girlfriend go into the store, but he was not simply giving me some glances. He was not hiding the fact that he was looking at me. I tried ignoring him because I felt incredibly weird when I made eye contact with a man, especially while working. However, I noticed this man was holding up his phone in a way where he was clearly taking a photo or photos of me just working. He held his phone with one hand clearly pressing a button near the bottom, and his other hand was cupping the front of the phone. Imagine how your parent would be taking a picture of you. He held his phone there for more than a few seconds and just smiled afterward. I told my boss later about it, and she asked why I didn't tell her about the man earlier. I explained that I was new to being approached in a work setting and tried justifying what the guy was doing. I truly don't know why he took a photo of me, since I was covered up because of how cold it was and he was wearing a mask due to COVID-19. To this random man who was taking photos of me, I hope you deleted them, and I hope for my sake that we never meet again. Honestly, this is going to sound like the plot to a terrible movie. Listen, I was naive. Despite my abusive childhood, I was still too trusting. Looking back now, I'm like, of course. In the end, I'm just so grateful that I wasn't hurt physically. I'm a 37-year-old female, but at the time I was 19 and living on my own studio apartment on the first floor of a very shady apartment complex. I have at least 4 creepy let's not meet stories from just being a resident there for only 6 months. They all would 100% qualify for this subreddit. This story isn't one of those 4 stories. However, the fact that I was an 18-year-old female living on the first floor is important to know. Let me start at the end. I was at a downtown street party with my sister. As we waded through the crowd, I saw Peter, not his real name obviously, amongst the other partygoers. I hadn't seen or spoken to him for a few years. The second I saw him, that night, the creepy calls and the voice came flooding back to me. That's when I realized that creep that called me that night was him. Peter was 21 at the time and I was 18, and I were co-workers at a restaurant that we would have the same shift a couple of times a week. We were just starting to get to know each other. One night we were talking on the phone. It was storming. I'd joked that weird stuff always happens on night like this. I didn't think too much of it. We hung up around 10 p.m. Not 10 minutes later, I get a call from a private number. I answer it. The caller said in a raspy male voice, "I'm watching you." I hung up immediately. They called again. I didn't answer, but they kept on calling. I finally answered to tell them to leave me alone. They then said, "I'm watching you through your window." I yelled at them to leave me alone and hung up. I turned off my lights, checked the door lock, and huddled into a corner out of sight by the window. They kept calling, then stopped. I called Peter, scared out of my mind, but he didn't pick up. I figured he'd still be up, that's why I called him. I called a few more times. He finally called back some 30 minutes later. He fed me this story of how his mom went to the emergency room for a heart condition. I frantically told him about the creepy caller. He was adamant about coming to my apartment to stay the night, even though his mom was in the hospital. He did spend the night on the couch. The next morning, he drove me to school. No discussion about what happened the night before. Nothing. As time passed, I realized I didn't have romantic feelings for him at all. He did. Needless to say, we had a falling out, then went our separate ways. That night haunted me for years. Among other things, mostly I was paranoid about having open curtains. I was relieved when I moved from that apartment complex to a second-floor apartment, but that night poisoned my mind. When I saw Peter at that party, after my matured brain finally made the connection, I wanted to confront him. But all I could do was leave and never see his awful face or hear his voice again. I really hope that he didn't prey on other women the way that he did with me. I'd like to mention that I don't recall, but I could have told him about the weird maintenance guy for the complex and how I suspected that he entered my apartment when I was gone. Or I may have told him about a male stalker when I was 16, whom I never have found out their identity. So, he could have used this as a fuel to try to frighten me into his arms. Well, Peter, thank God your plan didn't work. And let's never meet again. In 2018, I moved into a small 2-story property in England with my then boyfriend. It was in a quiet cul-de-sac with houses crammed together, all facing each other. I am very introverted and don't typically make a habit of socializing much with neighbors. Still, we naturally ran into a few and exchanged pleasantries. As you would, right? One of our new neighbors, Greg, was incredibly welcoming right off the bat. He was an older gentleman, the kind who'd stop you for a chat that would drag on and on until you made up an excuse for why you really had to get going. He shared local stories, asked about and took note of our birthdays, and even invited us around for a garden party where any and all were welcome. His house was directly across the street from where I lived, with his windows in clear view of mine. A couple of years passed by, and during this time my boyfriend and I split up. Although I never expressly shared this news with my neighbors, word must have gotten around with his car missing from the driveway. He moved out and left the country, but we stayed in touch regularly as friends. Having the house to myself felt lonely, so I got a cat to keep me company. He quickly became, and still is, my world. Greg would often flag me down to talk when he caught me leaving or returning to my house. Annoying, but I could live with it. I'd update my ex about weird little interactions with Greg, which we both found amusing to gossip about. One such incident was when Greg came to my door to hand over 2 of my parcels, one of which was a large table that he had yet to retrieve from his house. I had been raiding an Elder Scrolls Online at the time, doing a deathless speed run for an achievement. Given the time constraint in my game, I told him I'd leave the door unlocked so that he could simply put it by my door. I sat back down at my desk, put my headset on, and my group charged in at the final boss. I heard my front door opening, followed by the sound of my large parcel being placed down. Then footsteps approached me from behind. I peered behind me to see Greg standing there, eyes fixed on me. For fear of disappointing my raid group, I continued playing until we killed the boss, and then took off my headset. Greg's face lit up, and he went on to tell me how amazing it was to watch me play. I got the impression he'd never seen someone use a keyboard, let alone play games. He begged me to teach him and rambled on. He was clearly intoxicated, so I laughed it off and gave a non-committal response. Despite repeated attempts to politely make him leave, he could not be persuaded. He seemed disappointed when I walked over to my door and opened it to clearly signal it was time to go, but he left without further incident. In the UK, houses often have individual outdoor bins for trash, which have to be rolled out to the street the night before collections take place. You're expected to bring the bins back to your property after collection. I noticed someone kept bringing my bins back in for me. Was I blocking someone's car by being too slow to do it? Around the same time,
I also noticed someone had been using my bins. I brought it up to Greg one time. He pulled me over to talk, and he said the same thing had been happening to him. Maybe it was petty of me, but I decided to tape an old phone with a surveillance app to my window, overlooking the bins to figure out who it was. Lo and behold, it was Greg. I chalked it up to him having run out of bin space after the local council moved from weekly to bi-weekly collections due to staffing issues. Although it bothered me, my desire to avoid confrontation won in the end. Christmas rolled around, and the COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing. One late evening, I heard a knock at my door and walked over to see who it was. I had no peephole, so I opened the door not knowing what to expect. Greg stood at my doorstep, which was not particularly unusual. I'd gotten all too used to his antics. I immediately caught a strong waft of alcohol, but he spoke before I had time to process. He told me he had a Christmas present for me and handed over a red gift bag with colored tissue paper covering the contents. I really want to give you a kiss on the cheek, but I can't, not with this pandemic going around, he said. That gave me the heebie-jeebies, so I did all I could to politely end this interaction and retreat back inside. He held me up by rambling on about God knows what. I firmly told him that I was busy and needed to go. That's when he laid a hand on my shoulder, leaned in, kissed my cheek, and then walked off in the direction of his house. I closed the door and simply stood there for a few moments in shock. The present was odd. Underneath the tissue paper were 2 bottles of Belgian beer, a can of half-eaten Pringles, sour cream and onion, and a small plastic bag containing little chocolates. I recognized the latter item. A next-door neighbor with young children had come around to put these plastic bags with chocolate and a handwritten note, signed with their address, through everyone's mail slots a few weeks prior. It was a sweet gesture and probably something they came up with to keep the stir-crazy kids busy. Upon inspecting the re-gifted chocolates, I noticed he'd even forgotten to remove the note from the neighbor. This kiss and gift gave me bad vibes, and I regretted accepting it. I decided I was done being mispolite and resolved to be firm in my future rejections. On the second day of the new year, I was feeling lazy and ordered food delivery. A mere 5 minutes after receiving my order, there was a knock at my door. Knowing the delivery driver hadn't forgotten anything, I concluded this had to be Greg. And then it clicked for me. He'd often turn up immediately after anything was delivered to my door. He was constantly watching my house. Was he dumping trash in my bins as an excuse to hang around my house? He called out for me through the door. I felt too uncomfortable to answer and retreated upstairs out of view of the windows. Later that night, he came back and kept knocking, but once again I ignored it in hopes of him going away. The following day, I contacted the police to file a harassment report. I felt sheepish doing so. Was it really that bad? He was just a lonely old man, and I hadn't been firm enough. Upon being asked whether I wanted the police to speak with him, I told them I'd do it myself. I just wanted the report on file, in case anything else happened. I would later become grateful for filing the report. Greg turned up at my door a few days later, telling me how worried he was about me. I told him verbatim, "I think it's best if we don't have any contact going forward." His response was eerie. "I just wanted to be your friend." I held my ground, cut the conversation short, and closed the door. Finally, it's over, I thought. A year went by without incident. Everything seemed fine, with no knocks on the door or unwanted conversations while I was outside. One night in winter, I was leaving my house to get groceries. It was completely dark outside, save for a lamp post casting some sparse light onto the street. My driveway was at the side of my house, where the bins were stored. This driveway was blocked in by a tall panel fence to add some privacy, seeing as the kitchen window was directly next to it. You could see right into my kitchen and living room through this window. As I was outside locking the door, I saw a figure in the dark, slinking out of my driveway and behind the fence. I immediately unlocked the door and went back inside. It was dark. I could have imagined it, but my gut told me otherwise. Was there someone waiting for me behind the fence? Ultimately, I trusted my instincts and decided to forego the groceries for the night. I bought and mounted a motion sensor light to illuminate my driveway. The memory of the shadowy figure quickly faded in my mind, and the new light gave me some comfort that I'd at least be alerted if someone was lurking outside my window. A couple of months after the incident, I was in my kitchen getting some food for my beloved cat. The window was directly to my left, around 3 feet away from where I stood. As I dumped the cat food into a bowl, I suddenly became aware of my motion sensor light being on. I scanned the outside, not seeing anything, until my eye landed on something in the bottom corner of the window. I squinted, trying to make out what I was looking at. It somehow wasn't properly illuminated. I kept staring for what must have been 30 seconds. The light outside remained on. Suddenly, Greg pops up into view, directly outside. He'd been crouched down, peering in from the corner of the window. I'm normally someone who's cool as a cucumber. I never raise my voice or yell, but I truly lost it at that moment, screaming, "What are you doing?" repeatedly. He just stood there, then nonchalantly asked, "Are you all right?" I kept screaming, but now it was, "Why are you there?" He walked off into the dark. I immediately called the police. Typically, the police in England leave something to be desired, but I have to give them credit for how they handled the situation. They took my statement over the phone and gave me a reference number. I received a couple of phone calls with updates and was told they'd bring him to the station. I was also informed that he was known to the police for having previously followed young women. Sometime later, he was arrested at his property, in front of a wife I didn't even know existed. They did this to scare him, according to the officer I spoke to make a point. Sadly, he received nothing more than a police caution, which forbade him from being on my side of the cul-de-sac or contacting me. Still, it seemed to work. The window incident was the last real interaction I ever had with Greg. I did see him staring at me in the shower from his window one time when I forgot to close the blinds, but nothing else. I have since moved far away. So, Greg, you're gross, and now everyone in the neighborhood knows you're a creep. Let's not meet again, ever.
I had the closing shift, so I was alone. I was trying to get rid of a line. We closed in 5 minutes, and people kept coming in. So I announced only copies and prints. Shipments, which take 5 to 10 minutes each, were closed. I even turned someone else wanting a shipment away prior to this customer. This customer came in literally a minute to close with a big box. I saw her last in line, but didn't see the box as I was taking care of 3 customers at once. I looked at the clock, saw that it was closing time, and rushed to lock the door. I saw her box. I asked if it was a drop-off. All I'd have to do then was scan the label and give her a receipt. She said no, she wanted to ship it out. I said, "Sorry, we're not doing shipments now, we're closed." She didn't like that. She asked why she couldn't ship it out. I point to the door that showed the hours. "We're closed." She said, "No, you're not." Ah, one of those customers. I go back to the counter to finish with everyone else. She started getting loud, said that I'm a racist jerk. That's why I won't take her. I repeat, no, it's that we're closed, and told her to leave if she's going to be disrespectful. She countered that she will not leave. I said okay and tried to ignore her. She started cursing me out, cursing my mom out, cursing my non-existent kids out. I told her to leave several times. At this point, I will not take her regardless of what service she wanted. She got in my face several times, called me a punk, said she's gonna hit me, spit on me, knocked stuff over, called me a racist Puerto Rican jerk. If it matters, I'm not Puerto Rican. She even made an advance and laughed when I shielded myself. She did all of this in front of the other customers. Eventually, everyone else left and I was alone with her. It was well past closing time. Again, I told her to leave. Again, she said she's not going anywhere and kept calling me a racist. She said she'll wait until I leave so that she can follow me out, that she wants to know where I live. She kept getting close to the counter. getting in my space and following me around everywhere whenever I tried to move away from her. I called some coworkers from another store nearby to come over quick. I didn't want to be alone with her. She also taunted me to call the police, which I did because no duh. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher as I waited for the police to show up. She was still yelling and cursing me out the whole time I was on the phone, calling me all kinds of slurs and a racist. Then she took out her phone and started recording me. That set me off. I knocked the phone out of my face, told her to stop recording me. She screamed, smacked me in the face, broke my glasses and threw them in the trash. I told the dispatcher everything that was happening, and she said that she could hear, that it was a recorded line. The lady kept recording with her phone too, and made sure to shove it into my face several times, assuring me that I'm going on the internet, so everyone will know that I'm a racist. Police finally showed up. One took her outside and the other stayed with me to get our stories. My coworker then showed up and told the cops how he was watching the cameras from the other store and saw this lady acting deranged. Unfortunately, they weren't very helpful since the lady had footage that I knocked her phone. Therefore, I took action first and she could claim self-defense. We gave our statements. They left. I finally closed my register with my coworker's help and waited for my parents to drive the 40-minute commute to bring me my spare glasses, since I'm too blind to drive without them. In the end, I left the store an hour and a half after close. Thankfully, she wasn't waiting for me outside, and I didn't see her anywhere as I went to my car. Wherever you are, lady, I hope you feel better. Clearly, you're going through something and needed to get it out of your system through violence. But please, let's not ever meet again. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Get a good night's sleep, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye-bye now.